Thanks so much. Commiserations if you've heard me before, and apologies if you haven't. I hope there'll be a chance for some discussion at the end, so I'm going to move relatively quickly through my slides. And I should say from the off that I'm speaking mainly from my own experience in my own work. So I mean in no way to be... I can't speak for Archaeological Survey as a discipline because I don't have a broad enough experience. I've worked in some commercial organisations and mainly in the state sector. I guess I've been working for 23 years, so I'm a classic mid-career person. So I'd like to retire, but I can't. Especially because I've just had children. So I'm trapped. But I also have quite a bit of experience. So I'm starting to think that I want to do traditional surveying. And I'm getting sort of swept forward into the new age of archaeology. So what I want to talk about is 4 parts. Tiny little bit of background. Probably quite a lot about the past, because naturally I'm interested in the past being an archaeologist. A little bit about what we do now in HES, in Archaeological Survey, and a little bit about what's perhaps going to happen in the future. So the first thing I thought that was quite funny is, of course, one interesting thing is if you sit and ask yourself, what is Archaeological Survey? It seems obvious. Actually, you get 25 different answers. Particularly if you ask any archaeologist, you get completely different answers. So, as is the modern thing to do, I asked the internet. And blow me, but it gives a damn good answer. Much better than I would have done, and also instantaneously. It's extraordinary. I'm quite a cynic of ChatGPT, but the answer is brilliant. Systematic. You're wanting to locate archaeological sites, you want to record them, you want to map them on a different scale, and you want to analyse them. It's spot on. And then it splits it into... This is slightly strange because it's probably affected by American data, but it's not unreasonable. Digging, looking for sites, using evaluations and test pitting, fair enough, we don't do that. Walking about looking for sites, everyone still does that. And what people call remote sensing, which is aerial photographs and other methods. Quite a good explanation really. So lots of you will know this, but a very quick bit of background is it's always important to think about this stuff more broadly than your particular area. So I happen to come from near here, I'm interested in the archaeology here. But if one wants to think about, for example, how much we know, whether there's been a lot done, a little done, too much, too little, and different types of sites, you really need to take quite a broad perspective. So the first thing to realise is that we are incredibly well placed in a country like Scotland compared to most countries in the world. We've got a rich academic background, an incredibly good map base, and state-funded work for 100 years. Most countries don't have anything approaching that. So all of us can point out problems straight away. I can point out more than anyone. But we were starting off from a good place, and we were starting off from a good place as early as 100 years ago. I'm sure lots of you will have copies of McGibbon and Ross and Rodney Allen. Probably not a copy of Roy. But you'll know these characters. The point is simply that there was some excellent work before 1900. But there was also a strong perception that we needed a really clear idea of what there was in the country. So in the late 19th century, this was discussed in Parliament. We need to understand what's in the country in order that we can protect it. And what people were really thinking about at that time was forts, standing stones, cairns. They weren't thinking about local crofts, which I was visiting one today. That was far from their mind, not least because somebody was living in it at the time. That's just an example of an interesting local bit of work from Craig Fadrick, late 18th century. Really interesting from a history of Scottish archaeology perspective, not particularly accurate. Of course, you wouldn't expect that. So the very early state survey that my organisation was involved in, as lots of people heard of the Rock Commission and they've seen in inventories. And it's quite interesting to think about how they approached it at the beginning. So they approached it by looking at ordnance survey maps and literature. Then they went to local people who they thought would know, schoolmasters, ministers, generally the well-off, but they would of course speak to anybody who knew. They visited sites in the field. They wanted to identify which ones were worth protecting. So this is a crucial part of archaeological survey, is finding everything that's there and then deciding what is the best. It's quite a difficult thing to do. But crucially, and it's quite funny in a way, they weren't given any time scale, and they also weren't given any indication of the amount of detail we require. So they essentially decided how we're going to approach this. And this gentleman is Alexander Curl, who is a solicitor by training, very eminent, well-respected archaeologist of the early 20th century, who worked flat out until he dropped dead in 1946 or something. Brilliant scholar. He did a huge amount of the work originally himself. The whole thing was one man when it first started. And obviously nowadays that's ridiculous. But it was also an indication of how archaeology was seen by government. It was seen as important enough to fund one person. Having said that, 10,000, they recorded 10,000 monuments by World War II. That's a lot. It's a huge amount of work, actually. Given how disruptive the First World War was, and that we only had a staff of sort of 3 to 5. So they weren't doing too bad. Lots of you, I think, are interested in measure surveying. Lots of people have undertaken quite a lot of it. I think this is the first, or one of the very first surveys that the Commission did. One of the interesting things about it, David, is that it was done by architects. So archaeologists didn't know about surveying. Architects did, because they were trained in it at university. So one of the first things that this gentleman did was say, I need an architect to look at buildings, and I also need an architect because he'll know how to survey. Having said that, it's incredibly simplistic, that drawing. It's a little better than the Ordnance Survey, but not a lot. It's pretty basic stuff. But nonetheless, they felt that it was useful, and they were interested in sections which do help them interpret meanings. The purpose of the survey was to illustrate the text. It wasn't, something you often do survey for nowadays is to understand the monument. So you're not doing it to provide an illustration, you're doing it because the process of doing it helps you understand the thing you're surveying. That wasn't really the case at this stage. This is not helping you understand it. This is an afternoon's work by 2 architects, who most of the time were spending looking at highly complicated medieval castles. So somebody said to them, can you go and do that mod? Go and do a quick drawing back to the castles. Much more interesting. Quite right too. Things like this, which is mid-60s, this was incredibly difficult to produce at the time, technically, because you had to create a grid across a very long distance. So these kind of what we would think of as more of an archaeological landscape, where the person is surveying cut circles and fields of different phases. As far as I understand it, that's the first time they ever tried to do that. So they've been working for decades and decades before they had the courage to approach quite a large area, because it's technically difficult from a surveying perspective. Also interesting is an enormous difference in the quality of the illustration. So this is crude, this is not, and it's mainly because of the individual people involved. So the person who drew that was a highly skilled draftsman. So what I wanted to touch on when looking at the past is the fact that over the story of Archaeological Survey, there's been a series of what I would like to think of as revolutionary change that's changed the whole discipline of archaeology, as well as the survey part of it, making it unrecognisable. One of those is arguably happening just now, and there's been quite a few of them in the past, which I'll just go through. The first one was basically the war. A byproduct of the war was that you had very high quality air photographic coverage of the whole of Scotland. Very high quality, as in, even nowadays, that's a really good resource for mapping. It was taken in 47, so they're using huge, large format cameras and flying at 10,000 feet or sometimes lower. Total coverage, so that's the first time that kind of data is ever available. And for archaeologists, this was complete game changer, to such an extent that my organisation had to go back to where they were working and start the whole process again, because they realised we're going to find much more. And they did. Huge numbers of prehistoric and medieval sites were found through air photographs at that time. This is basically the very late 40s and into the 1950s. It completely changed the whole situation. This is 70 years ago. These images are still good today if you're interested in certain things. So this is where I live, in a house that's built here, and that's one of the best resources if you're interested in the 20th century history of the croft and how it's changed and people's living there. Brilliant. And you can get them, but unfortunately you have to pay for them. The other revolutionary thing is that this should really be broadening scope, is that the scope of archaeological survey has completely changed since the beginning. So in the beginning, people were interested, really in the beginning they were interested in the Romans. Then they became interested in prehistoric, and then they became interested in medieval. And they were strictly told, stop at 1700. Do not record things after 1700. It was beyond the scope. Of course, when they went to Edinburgh, so they published at Edinburgh in 1950, it didn't take a genius to think we better cover the new town. So this caused a big problem. So somebody said, okay, we can't use 1700. We're going to have to increase our scope. We're going to have to have some more flexibility. And this, I think, was a slippery slope, really. It caused all sorts of problems. Because then they dropped a period limit, well, not completely, but they certainly pushed it up to say about 1900. Nowadays we would tend to think about 1900. Added an exception to that being the World Wars, so the monuments of World War I and the monuments of World War II. And nowadays you get surveyors merely recording graffiti. I've seen a report recently, not by my colleagues, I hasten to add, which had park benches in it. If you want to read a really good archaeological paper, some of you have maybe heard of it, there's a very good paper about the archaeological excavation of a transit, and it's really good, because it's about where all the parks come from. And then they find lots of bits of material culture in the van, like cigarette papers and all sorts of things, and they follow their, those traces and tell a story about humanity. It's actually brilliant. But only a lunatic would record a transit van doing survey work. You wouldn't go out and map them. But I'm sure some of you have read John Hunter's book on the small hands, and it has in it Bullo's car in the 1910s, which is left in the sea outside Kinloch Castle. And that's actually quite an interesting archaeological site. So maybe it's not so mad after all. There's also some very good research on modern landfill sites and using archaeological methods. The point is, where do you stop? You've got to get a grip on scope, and very few people I know do. Everybody likes collecting. It's like, what's the word, numismatics. They like collecting stuff. So you go out with any surveyor, oh, I'll survey that, I'll survey that, I'll survey that. Don't. keep your scope strict, otherwise you just end up doing all of everything. So I quickly spoke about vertical air photography. That's still what lots of you look at today on Google. It's not satellite imagery. The bulk of it is vertical air photography. It's taken from planes. The other big game changer was archaeologists flying themselves looking for sites. In Scotland that kicked off in our organisation in '75, but there was a bit before through the RAF and the Ordnance Survey. This too has an absolutely enormous effect on the whole discipline of archaeological surveys. So finding these sites is survey, but it's done from planes. This is a very good example of a Cockmark sighting that's relatively obvious. Lots of them are. Look at the distribution. It's essentially the arable land, but there's a fair few up here. Taradale, you'll all know far more about than me. So this distribution is not particularly influenced. It's not sort of Edinburgh centric, because we sponsored other people to fly in other parts of the country. So it's a reasonably good representation of what there is. The point is, it's tens of thousands of sites. So if you're interested in an archaeological survey, you've got to be cognizant of what has been found from the air and sort of understand it. But crucially, if you look at the bottom, this is the discoveries over time that's going down. And that's mainly because we've found so much before. But there have been some excellent years since then, but it's going down. And in fact, the reality of it is the air programme has been cut. So there was an air photographic programme in my organisation and it's been stopped. That's partly because of this, and it's partly because of drones, which we'll come on to later. Next revolution. Many of you maybe have used one of these, or you've seen one, you've seen someone use them. This is called a total station theodolite, or an EDM. What's brilliant about it is it measures angles and distances very accurately. Distances as in 3 kilometres. So it means you can map landscapes in a way that you just could not before. You could not practically do it unless you had many people. So it was a total game changer, and it allowed you to survey and understand landscapes. So you'll notice when you think about archaeology in Scotland, a lot of it is about sites. So you go and visit a site. You go to Carlevay Broch. Sites are legally protected as little small areas that are protected, and you walk outside the area and it's no longer protected. That's partly because prior to the 80s, it was very difficult to both conceive of and certainly to map archaeology as a landscape. And this technology allowed you to do that. I showed you an example from the 60s where they had done a landscape. It was incredibly time consuming. So basically, it didn't really happen. Ironically, this is my colleague, I think it's maybe 20 years ago at the Hill of Many Stains. We had so many problems with the technology that we spent half the time fixing the flooding technology and the other half the time looking at the archaeology. That's one of the great difficulties with technology. Nonetheless, these are still a standard surveying instrument. You see them on roads regularly. We would tend to use them in woodland where you can't get satellite signals. So they still get used a lot. The thing to understand is they totally changed the game, allowing you to do things like this. That's 5 by 5 kilometres, all accurately mapped using air photographs and EDMs. That was just not possible until the 80s. For archaeologists, other people were doing it with lots of resources, but in the world of archaeology there's not that many resources. Not possible. So these kind of sheets just appeared around the very late 80s and early 90s. Next revolution, geographic information systems. I'm sure some of you will have used them. These things, this is starting to be quite a while ago, 95. But nonetheless, it's not everybody uses GIS all the time, and it still feels maybe a little bit frightening. It's not. It's simply a method of allowing you to look at maps with lots of different data sets at the same time. When I did a little bit of research about this, what I found amazing is that. So in 1995, the earliest GIS systems in our work still allowed you to access 80 data sets, as in historic maps, land use data, scheduling data, SSI stuff, things to do with management, but also some of them really important for your interpretation. A lot of these things, essentially this is what Google Maps is doing. Google Maps is really a GIS that everybody's using all the time. They don't talk about it like that, or CAN or mapping, or any of these places that allow you to look at sites and maps. They're basically GIS, so we're all using it all the time. But it's easy to forget quite how big a change that was. And even when I started my career in the early 2000s, when you wanted to look at historic maps, you had to go to the map library in Edinburgh and pull out the sheets and look at them and make traces and then go back and compare it with your information. not in RCAHMS, but when I was working in the commercial sector. We're getting there with our revolutions now. We're coming out of the past soon, fear not. The last, I think, or maybe the second last one, GPS. We've all got GPS now in our pockets. This is a survey grade GPS. This is £600 or whatever, this is £20,000. This is good to, in the region of 7 metres, that is good to less than a centimetre in relation to the Earth. So you don't need that kind of accuracy for lots of surveying, but it's just professional standard. The huge thing that's important about this in relation, if you imagine setting up a survey with this, it's what's called divorced. Lots of you will know what I mean. The survey is divorced. It's not connected to the Earth. So that means even when these things were produced, the surveyors had to do things like walk up mountains to get trig points and tie in their survey. Hugely time consuming. This plots exactly where you are in relation to the Earth in an instant when it was. So hugely time saving. Which is why you also see these on roads, and why it's a kind of standard go-to equipment for most commercial archaeologists. That would be their standard go-to piece of equipment. It's expensive, but you can hire them, and they're quite easy to use. It's also faster at taking a point. A single person can do it. On-site georeference. what's important to remember is these things are not the same as phones. So you get survey grade GPS, navigation grade GPS, and then bog standard in your pocket phones, and they're different and they provide levels of reliability that are different. Oh, it works. So there's just going to be a little animation that shows how data has come into our data set over time. Maybe you've seen it before at another talk. So we've looked at all these revolutions. All the time people are gathering information by surveying. We are, you are, other people are. And this is a little animation of how that data has grown over time. It's quite interesting in a way. I suppose what's interesting is that it's not that much. More over time. Don't worry about the annotations. The point being, oh, look at that. So that is created by harvesting years in our data set. So if you take all of the data we hold and you search it for the instance of 1908, 1909, you come out with this. So it's not perfect, but it's a very good indication. And the way that we know it's quite good is we know certain projects where massive data was found, they appear. So it's quite a reliable indication. Oh, almost there. So I spoke a little bit about how we approach things right at the beginning, 100 years ago. I shouldn't say we, because obviously I wasn't alive then. Right at the end of the Royal Commission, before it was absorbed, things were rather different. So multi-scalar, by what I mean is it was normal to map landscapes and also look at sites and objects, so things like crosses. You might survey a cross at 1 to 1. You might survey a building at 1 to 100, you might survey a landscape at 1 to 2,500. So that notion of working from very, very small scale to very, very large scale was normal. And it's important cognitively and also technically. We were no longer publishing sort of big books, you just have a big database. And there's a huge database with all this data in it that's constantly changing all the time. It has to be backed up in 30 million places and all the rest of it. But, you know, the honest truth of it is the discipline within the organisation found it quite difficult to adapt to these technological changes, partly because the technology is moving much more quickly than the people. So there's some people in our organisation, not now, but there were, who did 45 years public service. The guys who did, the architects who produced that plan that I showed right at the beginning, one of them worked for 45 years. So by the time he was coming out, it was all completely and totally changed. He was a brilliant architectural historian, but technically he was obviously getting a bit out of date. I'm getting a bit out of date and I'm only 49. They obviously did some brilliant work. Nobody thinks they did enough, across the board. Say, oh, I didn't do this, I didn't do this, I didn't do this. Oh, okay, fair enough. So that's a lesson learned. How do you do more? Is one of the questions. But part of this is because the whole process of archaeological survey is cyclical. You don't survey things and finish and go home. You do, but then someone else comes along 10 years later and they always find new things. They find something you didn't find, or they find something you thought you found, but it's actually something else. So the whole process of archaeology, of archaeological survey, is cyclical. What's interesting about that, part of the reason it's cyclical is because the condition of monuments is really important. And it's becoming increasingly important. How well preserved is something and how is it changing over time? So all survey will be superseded. All surveys need to think about other work. That seems fair. I showed you a very early drawing. This is a very late drawing. Unusually, I actually drew that, which I'm surprised at, but I expect it took me a very long time because my colleagues are very strict about one's hashers. Obviously, things moved on somewhat in terms of illustrative depiction, but it's still a two-dimensional drawing. Accuracy and precision have improved. The way that we classify things, we're much, much clearer about that. The way we locate things, clearer, period, description, depiction. Everything's got better, but I remember talking to a very experienced archaeologist at a conference once, and he said, "Why are these brown?" So the brown is natural
The black is man-made. So one of the absolute fundamentals of archaeological survey is distinguishing between what is natural and what is person-made. This guy had been in archaeology for 40 years, 30 years, and he didn't know. Now this makes you think, we may have a problem here. The problem is, this may be far too detailed for most users. Most people looking at this don't understand how to interpret it. They don't understand what we're trying to convey. They understand that drawing right at the start, but they don't understand that. And that, I think that was in the region of, the survey was maybe 3-person weeks, and the drawing itself is probably a week's work or something like that. I guess. But who are we doing it for? And are they getting what we're doing? So, now we're moving into the present. If somebody asked me to say one thing about archaeological survey going into the past, it's that you need to remember it's two different things. It's archaeology and it's survey. And you need them both. If you do archaeology without somebody who understands survey, you're in trouble because everything's in the wrong place. If you survey without the archaeology, you basically get all your classifications wrong. So there's lots of people who are good at using GPSs, but they don't know what they're looking at. So you end up with a map with loads of data, but all the classifications are wrong. And you have to have both. This guy's the surveyor and illustrator, this guy's the archaeologist. What I really like about this is they're thinking. You can see them thinking and talking. That's what it's all about. Good. That's not happening so much now, but for some reason. But yes, it's good. Proper people doing proper work in the 1950s.
And properly dressed.
Properly dressed. This is and this is it's a site called the Dunyan, and it was being quarried, and that's the explosions for the quarry. So they were responding to the fact that it was about to be partly exploded. A very nice picture for showing the sort of act of thought. You'll have done this and seen people doing it. I like a good picture because it's so honest. So, into the present. Very quickly, all this slide is saying is archaeological survey is a tiny part of a huge organisation. HES is huge. There are, where's the staff? 2,000 employees and volunteers, of which there are 11 archaeological surveyors, which are one. So it's a very small part of a big beast. Mainly because most of what HES is about is the big sites. Edinburgh Castle, Stirling Castle, and also the designated sites. Excuse me, what is protected by law. So we are, people are always saying to me, why can't you do this, why can't you do this, why can't you do this? We are at the very, very bottom of the feeding trough, sad to say. Not perhaps the absolute bottom, but getting near. Huge organisation, surveys a small part, but there's another thing in here that's kind of interesting, this kind of thing, 1 million visits to Canmore, 5 million searches. So lots of people are using this sort of information, but the gathering of the information is perhaps not a strategic priority. The other thing that's interesting to think about, if you're interested in archaeological sites, there are about 160,000 of them. So if you say you started in 1907 with none, 10,000 by World War II, 160,000 now, and it's obviously going up all the time. That's not including buildings, and it's also not including shipwrecks. You can sort of calculate the figure in different ways, but that is a reasonable figure. And I'm sure a lot of you are thinking, but I know of lots of sites that aren't recorded, aren't in the database. So imagine how big the number really is. Of that huge number, 8,200 are scheduled, so they're protected by law. It's a criminal act to damage them. That means there's a team in HES who manage those scheduled monuments. So they, for example, manage people to visit them every 5 years. They look after consents if somebody wants to excavate. So there's a whole sort of infrastructure that comes around being scheduled. And then, the other thing that we hold, of course, is archival materials. So there's a huge amount of information about a pretty huge amount of sites, of which a small number are protected by law. Now the other ones have protection through what I call county mountie, council archaeologists. So those council archaeologists, depending where they are in the country protect those sites, but they don't have the same teeth as the shouting links. That's not a sentence, but you can imagine this data set has everything from perfect to utter rubbish, and we know that. You know, there's all sorts of utter garbage in the data set. There's also quite a lot of good stuff, and probably in the round, it's quite good. But it's hugely varied, and there's never been the resource to fully quality control it. So if you go out and report a site in discovery and excavation in Scotland, it will not be quality controlled. It will be sort of grammatically controlled to see it's not rubbish. But if you say, I've found a chamber cairn, it will go in, whether you know what a chamber cairn is or not. Now that's good because it's democratic, but it's also mad because you get some really bad stuff. You can imagine. The other interesting thing is the bigger the data set gets, the harder it is to change. So if you've got 500 sites, depending on what project I'm working on, I might be able to work on 50 sites a day. If I'm working quite fast and sort of looking at classifications and analysing sites straight into camera, 50 sites a day is quite quick. 500 is fine, that's 2 weeks' work. So things like chamber cairns is fine, you can work on them easily. Farmsteads, of which there's sort of 60,000 in Scotland, you cannot do a project on the whole of the data set, it's too big. So the data set becomes more and more patchy over time. So these are real significant structural issues that we're sort of dealing with all the time. In archaeology more generally, there's I think there's 500 or 600 of us in Scotland. It's difficult to be sure, but it's around that sort of number. 70% work in the commercial sector. Some of them are surveyors and very good surveyors. But most of them are diggers. There's obviously external standards which are getting better and better and better. But quite a small number they're field archaeologists in the sense that they're diggers. But very few people are field archaeologists, which was as OGS Crawford meant in the 40s, which is going out classifying sites in the field. So that's really what we have done for a long time. The tradition of field archaeology is survey. But nowadays, really, most archaeologists are obviously more diggers. So there's not that many people that you can really say are a professional field archaeologist in the sense of a surveyor. So, now this is the same as lots of things in the world, I think. There's less people doing work, there's far more technology. This is over time. There's less field work, there's more remote sensing over time. But this goes for everything, doesn't it? More working from home, less going to the office. Interestingly, this is reversing. This is going back on itself. So there was a movement to thinking about landscapes, and it's starting to turn back on its head, and that's because of lack of resource. So people are tending to think a bit more about saying we need to know what's really important and we need to look after it. Whereas there was a time when resources were more plentiful, and people were saying let's look at everything and think about whether or not it's important. And of course, this is important going back to that drawing I showed you. CRM means Cultural Resource Manager. So the people who are making decisions about archaeological sites. Who gets to dig them? Is it damaged? Are we going to court? Are we funding this excavation? All that kind of stuff. These people are busy. The people dealing with planning in HES are so busy that their heads are coming off. They are stressed out. They do not have time to pore over incredibly complicated, interesting drawings. They simply want to know, is it a ford and what are its boundaries? You know, that is it. They don't have the time. And this stuff's getting more serious. If you think about the planning context around here, there's huge amounts of infrastructure going on. There are people dealing with that on a day-to-day basis. They don't have time to look at books about Bronze Age landscapes. They just need to know what's really important and then start thinking about how to respond to the challenges. This is difficult, of course, because good data is good management. So the bedrock has to be correct or things go awry. So, many people say to me, but we haven't done this. We know. We know. So there are huge gaps in our knowledge. We get this. But on the other hand, there has been a lot done. So these are survey projects since '87. That's not that bad. It's a national footprint. That's not including everybody else. So the one way of thinking about this is there's been a huge amount done. The other way of thinking, oh, there's not been enough done. But there's structural issues with the data, and there's structural issues with roles and responsibilities in the sector, I would say. Our experience is normally when we work somewhere, the number of sites goes up to 200%. Sometimes it might be 60 or something. It's quite often 200%. But what doesn't go up by anything like that is the number of really important sites. So you tend to find 6,500 pens, 4.5 million shealing hats, of which there are tens of thousands in Scotland, and maybe a Bronze Age cairn. The Bronze Age cairn is rare and exciting. The pens, not so. The shealing hats are in the middle. So there's a huge amount of more to be found, but if you think about chamber cairns as a good example, there's very, very few chamber cairns still to be found. We find one sort of every week. Since I worked there for 14 years, we've found 2, I think, possibly 3. There's not a lot to come. Partly because they're huge, of course, and also because people have been interested in them for a long time. Importantly, most of the 8,000 really important sites arguably don't have high quality modern data. They don't have a professional outfit who's done a 3-dimensional survey, good interpretation and a summary. Most of them are relying on good quality data that's up to 60 years old, let's say, something in the region of 50 to 60 years old. LiDAR, so this is what we're using now, no present revolution, brilliant. Little example of how difficult LiDAR is. This is freely available LiDAR on the National Map Library website. This is an air photograph of the same place. Now, the reason that building's not there is because it's been processed to remove woodland, but it's been processed crudely, not by a specialist in archaeology. So if you were using that as your primary data set and you were interested in that, which is admittedly probably somebody was living in it in the early 1920s or even the early 1950s, but nonetheless, we would normally record a thing like that. So it's not as it seems. The processing of it is incredibly important. Poor quality LiDAR is trouble, as in if the resolution is not sufficient for archaeology, it's difficult. If it's processed by somebody who doesn't know what they're doing, it can also be problematic. And as with any data set, you can misunderstand it. So it's easy to see it as a golden panacea, and it sort of is, but I feel like it doesn't make field archaeology easy. It's just another data set. So in the same way that ROI is really useful, brilliant, but complicated, so is LiDAR. The other thing I think that I would wish to emphasize is a data set that shows an archaeological site is not archaeology. It's only archaeology when the archaeologist is the process of doing interpretation that makes it become archaeology. So if I show you a picture of a chamber cairn, or this, this is not archaeological. But me saying to you, this is a standard Hebridean 3-bay house, of which there's zillions around the same side, probably built in the 1890s, that is archaeological, that's interpretation. It's the same with the LiDAR. LiDAR in and of itself is not archaeological, it's just data. I hope that sort of makes sense. I won't go into how LiDAR is created. It's just a laser scanner. It's just sending out a laser and measuring the point. Just like the total station I showed in an earlier slide. It sends one. All that LiDAR is a plane with a big scanner that sends lots and lots and lots of those all the time. So it's just scanning the ground. The coverage is patchy, and the quality of the data is variable. The data here is not very good, and that means it can be quite problematic for archaeology because you see things that aren't real and you don't see things that are. So it can be a wee bit difficult. What's amazing about it, and this is quite a good slide that my colleague did, is this was done manually in 1997. It took 2 people 2 days, so they produced a 3-dimensional shape model, a digital surface model. This is freely available for anyone. So that's what's the change. You've been able to produce these kind of data sets for 30, 40 years, but it took a long time to do it. Threat in the present, as it was in the past, is still a huge part of all this. People are worried about coastal erosion in particular. Forestry is becoming a big deal again. Agriculture, development, arguably lack of awareness is really important to archaeological sites and whether or not they survive. This is a really interesting. This is 1996. I'm sure you'll probably all have a copy of the Highlands Guide to Buildings Archaeology by Jana Close Brooks. Really good. And it says this in 1986. That's totally true today, nearly 30 years later. The exact same thing is true. And what I was trying to touch on before is that another thing that's really changed is this notion of cultural significance, which some of you may be aware of, some of you not. So it came actually, as far as I understand it, it came from Australia, and it was people trying to recognise that some places were very important to indigenous communities and others weren't. And they worked out a method of thinking about that, and it's been stolen by archaeology. The idea of it is simply that you need to think about the difference in importance between different sites. So it's not a good use of to be honest, of my time to spend 2 hours looking at that. It's probably not a good use of my time to spend 2 hours looking at most sheilings, because once you see 100, they're pretty similar. There's a few that are designated, and they should be, because they're particularly large groups. You sometimes get quite complicated examples, you occasionally get a lot of documentation, which is actually far more rare than the sites themselves. But one needs to actually think about this, because you've got limited resources. So what would be most of the shealing sites in Scotland are on OS maps, not them all, not by any means, but most. Some are designated. Is it a good use of my time to find millions more? Possibly not. But twinning pens are probably the least. A twinning pen is not a significant thing. You get them all over the place. They're secondary. They don't have archaeological deposits. They're relatively modern. If you excavated one, it wouldn't tell you anything. This is important. If the thing you're surveying, if you excavated it and you wouldn't learn anything, then that's a good way to think about what is and isn't important. If you excavated Craigfadrig, you'd have a multi-volume research project. If you excavated quite a lot of small, less significant features, you'd barely be able to say anything. So that's quite a good way of thinking about relative importance. It's kind of obvious though, isn't it? You can see Craigfadrig from everywhere around the whole of the Google Firth. It's important. So there's this. So we're starting to think this is much more to the fore of people's mind now. That we've got not important, very important, and that you should think about that when you're thinking about surveying. We still use aerial photographs day in, day out. They are the bread and butter, really. That's not a spelling mistake. They are slowly getting better over time. So I think 10 to 20 years from now, they'll be double the resolution they are now. So they're getting better. And they're also becoming much more regular. So normally in our work, we have access to maybe 3 or 4 different dates, something like that. So it varies on parts of the country. It's obvious, but some, you can be lucky. This is an incredibly good shot of this site in Inverness. That one's hopeless, that one's in the middle. That one you could map the site at a small scale using that photograph. Powerful. So aerial photographs are still probably more important than LiDAR because there's national coverage and there's multiple iterations. And of course cameras are cheaper than LiDAR scanners. But we're obviously moving into the age of the drone. I bought some drones along just for fun. Drones are great because they're fast, they're incredibly fast. You can go and stand on a site like this and you can capture 600 images in half an hour. Incredibly powerful for speed of data capture. They're getting more flexible, but they are quite closely regulated. So we have to have training, you have to have insurance, you can only fly 500 metres away, you can only fly to 400 feet. Whereas normally air photography was done at 1200 or 1500 feet. What that means is you can't take a photograph of hut circles and field systems. You can't physically do it with a drone. They won't go high enough up. So some people think drones have replaced aircraft. In fact, they do different things. And that's a bit frustrating because it's not well understood. The other thing that they don't provide is survey control. So you can take hundreds of images and produce a three-dimensional model relatively easily, but it won't be spatially correct, or not from a surveyor's perspective. So a surveyor would immediately say, where's the control, how is it controlled? And normally for us that means putting ground targets out and surveying them with professional equipment. So essentially stretch the photos to fit that grid. That makes them spatially correct. So I was talking to a colleague of mine the other day who's a surveyor, and he kind of said, well, I wouldn't really ever do that without control, because it's not satisfactory quality. So this is the thing about a surveyor and an archaeologist, two different skill sets. BVLOS or BVLOS means at some stage in the future people are going to be allowed to fly drones beyond the visual line of sight. So the regulation of drones is that the pilot in command, as they call it, has to be able to see the drone. If not, you can potentially get into quite serious trouble if there's a problem. Now, BVLOS, it should say, beyond visual line of sight, that will come in the future, and that will be another revolution, because it might mean that you can stand that small drone will fly for 35 minutes. So it could flying at 10, 20 metres per second, gathering data all the time. So the likelihood is that we move to a situation where we become more and more powerful tools for gathering information, not for telling you, not for doing the archaeology, but for gathering the information. Going back to what I was saying short ago about the difference between data and archaeology, that's data. That's archaeology. That took two really good people ages, and it's highly complicated survey, one of the more complex that was ever really been undertaken. It's about 25 years old. It's also, arguably that's a hypothesis, because each one of the decisions that these two people have made is a matter of judgment. They were experienced people, although, one of them had 30 years experience, one of them had 10 years experience. It will be broadly correct. But think of the number of relationships it shows. It's an exceedingly complicated piece of work. Who is using that and what for? Or is it simply an academic exercise? An impressive one nonetheless. But that is obvious, that roundhouse, isn't it? But the key relationships probably aren't obvious until somebody points them out and works them out. Sorry to labour the point, but it's an important one. This is the most sort of difficult survey that we've done recently of a single site. So a site like this, the Traprain was surveyed by the Commission in the 50s, and they took all the staff. It was by far the most complicated thing they'd done. It took 2 weeks or something. The architects, there was only 5 of them, a volunteer, 2 architects and 2 archaeologists, and the secretary, the boss, everyone. Difficult thing to do in those days, because there's no digital data, and you can't see stations. I think they had 50 control stations. Hard thing to do, and actually very good when you go back to it. That was probably 3 to 4 person weeks on site. It draws on all sorts of different information, aerial photographs. We produced 3D information from photographs taken from a plane. We surveyed most of the features with GPS. So all sorts of different techniques, lots of research, looking at old soil maps, looking at our old soil. So for example, the excavations are drawn from one source, and other things are drawn from another source. So incredibly time-consuming, difficult thing to do. Nobody has ever said, what a useful thing. Not one. Not a single person. But this is a scheduled monument. Management decisions are made about it all the time. Interestingly, don't tell anyone, but
there was an archaeological excavation in here, in an area that for our perspective, from an archaeological survey, was patently natural. And it went through the whole process of somebody applying for scheduled monument consent, discussing it, theorising it, excavating it, working out its natural value. Fascinating. Now that was before this plan was done, but arguably it shows why it's important. But it's not exactly intuitive, is it? I mean, it would need a bit of explaining to somebody. I'm not that sure we'll ever do anything like that again. But it's not impossible. Archaeological survey, after all this work, remains really difficult. It is a difficult thing to do. I find it difficult, and I've been doing it full-time for 14 years. Here's a drawing and a description. Interesting, well thought through description, cogent, quite a neat drawing. Somebody's obviously been trained, it's quite neat hashers. If I was way over there and I saw that drawing, I'd immediately think, that's something wrong with it. What's wrong with it is it's totally natural. It's a natural feature. Misinterpreted and misunderstood, described, planned at 1 to 100 by people who've spent hours and hours on site. And I could tell you from over there, that's not right. You can tell by looking at it, it's not right. Anybody can tell, it resembles a building. Now buildings can end up looking like that if they're excavated or partly demolished or something. So I just use it as an example. It doesn't matter who did it, I just use it as an example. This is relatively recent. Carefully described, drawn in some detail. It's an entirely natural site. It is in fact slope wash. So if you stand on that site and you glance to the right, there's a great big hole in a very steep slope, and the soil has come down, formed a large pile, which has then grown over, and perhaps 40 years ago, and might end up looking fascinating. So we see things like this quite a lot, to be honest, and it's because it's hard. It's not really a criticism, it's because it's actually quite a difficult thing to do. Humps and bumps, buildings obviously less. So, the future, very finally, very last few slides. Massive change is coming at us. There's afforestation is going up again. So climate change is happening, afforestation is happening. There are still justifications that there always were. More and more and more data is coming all the time. This applies to everything. It applies to archaeology as well. So the coverage and the quality of all these data sets is going up. It's not going down. It's going up. And it includes everything. It includes things like historic maps. The number of estate maps available online never goes down. It always goes up. Unless they're in private hands, of course. In which case sometimes it doesn't work. And one of the responses to that is to work out ways of doing things more quickly. So we have geophysicists, and they're constantly trying to work out how can we cover larger areas. So, for example, using a cart quadruples the coverage. And the next thing they're looking at is using, like, for example, a quad or something, so you can speed up. This is not because we want to go fast. It's just an inexorable shift in technology and demand. Artificial intelligence is going to affect archaeological survey. So, to give you an example, this on the left-hand side, this is artificial intelligence trying to identify archaeological sites in a LiDAR visualization. You can see straight away it's doing it, as in it's finding the squares. You know, the squares are telling you what it's found. The other thing is it's giving you a confidence rating, and it's trying to classify it. And our experience of this is it's pretty damn good. But it depends on what we call its learning set. So my boss sat down and provided 200 roundhouses to the AI. And the AI used that data to then look for other ones. So without his data, it doesn't really work. This is obviously the whole thing with AI in general, but it's definitely coming. Somebody's trying to commercialise it. If you imagine, 20, 30 years from now, there'll probably be a national data set for Scotland with LiDAR. There will come a time where somebody can just simply go,
find all the chamber cairns, and 3 seconds later, it'll be like, there they are, and there will be, there will be new ones, unquestionably new ones, and it'll also point out one or two that don't make any sense, existing ones. So this stuff is coming at us like a tsunami, because I am an AI expert. Really good example of my failing. So this site was picked up for one of our surveys. I visited it, didn't like it, natural. The AI said, no, it is something, we're not sure what. And then we went with a whole squad of us and everyone decided it was real. The AI was right, I was wrong. And I'm wrong, I don't know, 10% of the time. It's just, that's okay. But you end up with this interesting question of where do people like me end up? What will become my role? Look at these guys. This is Ian Scott, the illustrator of carved stones, who died relatively recently. He spent 40 years making the most fantastic drawings. And then, like a tsunami, people have just come along and started taking 600 pictures, producing a 3D model and on to the next one. And he's sitting there drawing these beautiful, beautiful drawings with incredible care and attention to detail, often visiting the sites multiple times to correct them. But the world has changed. This is Charles Calder, who excavated lots of sites in Shetland, who was an architect. There he is, very carefully making finishes to a drawing of I think it's Ree Roy on the south side of Loch Broom in the 1940s. But anybody can go and stand there and literally just go like that for 20 minutes, go home, shove it through a computer and come out with a three-dimensional model. It's sort of, in a way, it's kind of madness. And that's it, on that note. That is the end of my talk. So that's some thoughts. And I look forward to getting some questions, either here now or then.